During the early days of 1924, 3 fur trappers working out in the wilds of Central Oregon were murdered in a brutal and savage manner. Almost a century later, the full circumstances surrounding their deaths still remain a mystery. Who was responsible for the Lava Lake murders? The weather conditions had been harsh and unrelenting for 2 solid weeks before their journey had commenced, and the thick layers of snow which now covered the landscape had made progress particularly hard-going for the 2 travelers. Having finally caught sight of their objective, both men found themselves mired with a creeping sense of foreboding. Ahead of them lay a solitary wooden cabin, situated just on the outskirts of a densely wooded area which extended as far as the eye could see. As the pair labored on towards their destination, they grimly noted the absence of any tracks in the snow which blanketed the path leading up to the lodge, and observed that no smoke was emanating from the chimney. The signs of life and habitation which they had so desperately hoped to see, were sadly not present. For Owen Morris, this was a journey which had proven particularly harrowing. It had been over 3 months since he had last heard from his younger brother. Now, as he and his fellow traveler approached the remote cabin, where Dewey Morris and 2 other men had been working as trappers, his worst fears were on the cusp of being confirmed. There was no reason for such a long period without contact, which could only mean that something bad must have happened. Cautiously nudging open the front door, Morris drew his pistol and motioned for his companion to do the same. For the briefest of moments, Pearl Linz had looked startled at the request, before regaining his composure and complying. Being the superintendent of a local fish hatchery, he rarely had cause to carry a firearm, but Morris had been insistent that he bring one along on this journey. As the 2 men stood and surveyed the interior of the cabin, both came to the realization that there was little chance of finding the occupants alive. The hunting equipment belonging to the trappers lay discarded to one side, and the remains of a morning meal were welded to the base of a pan sitting on the nearby stove, having blackened and burned long before the fire beneath it had died away. Morris felt his grip tighten on the handle of his revolver, his head swimming with a mixture of sadness and anger. He took in the papers and rubbish strewn around the cabin floor, and the emaciated body of a cat which lay dead in the corner, before turning on his heel and walking back outside. There was no way that the trappers would have ventured out into the forest without their rifles, not whilst they still drew breath. He would spend the next few minutes checking the nearby traps and lines, all of which contained the frozen remains of animals that had clearly died some months previous, before a cry from Linz brought him running back to the rear of the cabin. A small holding pen had been built there to keep any foxes which had been captured alive by the trappers. Abandoned on the ground, directly in the center of this structure, lay a discarded wooden mallet, covered in blood. It was the dying weeks of 1923 that Dewey Morris had been approached by one of the local logging contractors, and offered employment for the duration of the winter. Ed Logan had explained to the 23-year-old that he owned a small cabin, situated a short hike from the shores of Little Lava Lake, and that he was looking for a team of trappers to spend the Christmas period there. The youth had jumped at the opportunity, being unemployed at the time, and fully aware of the high price which pelts from the nearby Deschutes National Forest could fetch at market. And so it was that he found himself spending the season out in the wilderness, alongside 2 other local workers by the names of Edward Nichols and Roy Wilson. 2 days before Christmas, Morris and his colleagues had briefly returned to their hometown of Bend, their sled heavily laden with the skins of animals which they had captured in their traps. Even after handing the bulk of their labors over to Logan, the 3 hunters had managed to make a healthy profit from their share of the endeavor, which Morris had been keen to spend on an evening of drinking with his family. The group were seen on one more occasion following that weekend by a resort owner named Alan Wilcoxon, who had stopped by the cabin on the 15th of January whilst en route to Bend to pay his regards. He would later recount how all 3 men had been in high spirits, having enjoyed a high degree of success with their undertaking. By the start of there had been no further visits or correspondence from the trio, which prompted Logan to enlist the help of Dewey's older brother, requesting that he go check on the 3 trappers. What Owen Morris and his friend Paul Linz discovered at the cabin after they had fought their way through the snow-covered wilderness would cause them to turn around and hurry straight back into town to report the matter to the local sheriff. A large search party was mustered by the townspeople, led by Deputy Sheriff Clarence Adams, who enlisted the services of a number of trackers and game hunters familiar with the area. Upon reaching the cabin, this group then divided into a number of smaller parties and spread out, in order to cover as wide an area as possible around the abandoned dwelling. One group, led by Adams, made their way directly towards the nearby lake. After traveling a quarter of a mile, they came across a wooden object, half buried in a large drift. They immediately began to dig away at the thick layers of snow, soon discovering the sled which belonged to the missing trappers, its rear wooden paneling stained with what appeared to be blood. Adams and his team pushed a further 100 meters to the shores of the lake itself, where they encountered a large hole which had previously been cut into the surface ice and had since frozen over again. Not far away, under a thicket of trees, lay a further grisly discovery. Alongside the battered remains of a number of foxes, presumably the ones that had been kept in the pen behind the cabin, lay a torn and bloodied scalp of dark brown hair and several human teeth. Despite being no strangers to the harsh and savage nature of the isolated environment they lived and worked in, several of the search party immediately pulled away in revulsion, clearly upset by the horrifying nature of the remains. It fell to the sheriff to pull his people back into line, ordering them to break up the ice in and around the frozen hole that they had discovered. A short time later, the bodies of the missing men were located. Floating just beneath the surface of the lake, all three corpses displayed wounds consistent with having been shot by a pistol or shotgun, with evidence that someone had also used a hammer of some kind to inflict additional injuries, both before and after the point of death. A gaping shotgun injury had hollowed out most of Roy Wilson's right shoulder, but the wound which ultimately ended his life had been administered after this with a pistol. The fatal round had entered his skull just below the right ear. Similarly, young Dewey Morris' left arm had been completely shattered by a close-range shotgun discharge, and he had subsequently been dispatched with a shot to the back of his head by a low-caliber weapon. But it was the body of Edward Nichols that provided the most telling evidence of what had transpired. Chillingly, whilst the lower part of his jaw had been decimated, most likely by a shotgun blast, he was still wearing his reading glasses. More importantly, the pocket watch which was retrieved from inside his jacket had been shattered by the same impact, and had stopped at 9:10 a.m. This evidence, combined with the remains of the breakfast that had been found back at the cabin, suggested that the three trappers had somehow been lured outside and then murdered in cold blood, just after they had awoken one morning. Adams surmised from the injuries that the victims had had no ability or opportunity to defend themselves during the attack. As he had watched the bodies being loaded onto sleds to take back into town, he found himself struggling to come up with a motive for the murders. The three dead men were still in possession of their personal effects, and a number of valuable pelts had been left behind at the crime scene. But of one thing he was quite sure: the local community would expect an answer, and for an offender to be brought to justice for this savage and senseless crime. Suspicion for the murders initially fell on a local woodsman and moonshiner known as Indian Erickson, who resided on the banks of Coulter's Lake, half a dozen miles southwest of the crime scene. He was a heavy drinker, with a history of troublemaking and petty theft. And it wasn't a great leap to propose that he was the perpetrator of a robbery gone wrong. Although when Erickson was arrested and questioned about the killings, it soon became clear that there were a number of witnesses who could provide alibis on his behalf, and the case against him was quickly dropped. It was in the aftermath of Erickson's release that Edward Logan approached the sheriff's office and voiced his suspicions about a rival trapper named Lee Collins. He told the authorities that Collins was suspected of stealing from the traps and lines that had been laid down by his employees, and that there was also an existing issue between him and Ed Nichols, who had once caught Collins stealing his wallet in a bar. Accordingly, Deputy Sheriff Adams began to make inquiries, which immediately added considerable weight to Logan's claim. In reality, Lee Collins was in fact a convicted criminal by the name of Charles Kimsey, who was already wanted by the authorities in connection with an alleged attempted murder. In 1923, he had attacked a stagecoach driver named W.O. Harrison, throttling the man and then throwing him down a well. Harrison had somehow survived the ordeal, managing to climb out of the well and make a statement to the sheriff. Upon hearing of this development, Kimsey had then fled into the wilderness. Before he could be located and apprehended, immediately after Kimsey had been named in the national newspapers as prime suspect for the slayings, Adams was contacted by the Portland City Police Department. On January 22, 1924, a week after the last known sighting of the victims, Kimsey had been encountered by a traffic officer, asking for directions to a reliable fur dealer. The deputy sheriff hastily made his way across to Portland, and began to question all of the known fur dealers in the city. It was soon discovered that not long after Kimsey's encounter with a traffic officer, a man had attended the Schumacher Fur Company, seeking to sell a number of high-value animal pelts. The owner of the business, Carl Schumacher, had paid him $110 for the skins. At the end of this transaction, the customer had signed a receipt for the payment, using the name and trapper's license of Edward Nichols. Frustratingly, it would be some time before the police were able to trace the fugitive. Reports came in from far and wide claiming he had been sighted, sometimes in 2 different states at the same time. It would be a further 5 years before he was located, hiding out in the town of Kalispell in neighboring Montana. Kimsey was quickly charged with the triple murder and thrown in jail awaiting his trial, though the case against him collapsed at court. In addition to the 2 main witnesses failing to pick him out from an identity parade, Kimsey was also able to produce a number of alibi witnesses who confirmed that he had in fact been working in Colorado at the time of the murders, on the construction of the Moffat Tunnel. One man who was able to identify Kimsey from the lineup was W.O. Harrison, who was adamant that the fugitive was the same man who had tried to kill him. On the basis of Harrison's evidence, Charles Kimsey was convicted of robbery and attempted murder, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He would later go on to die within the confines of the Oregon State Penitentiary. Still protesting his involvement in the Lava Lake murders, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. The Deschutes County Sheriff's Office remained convinced of Kimsey's guilt, and consequently closed the case with no other suspects ever identified for the crime. The notion that one man alone could have overpowered and killed 3 fit and healthy hunters does, however, seem a bit of a stretch, alongside the evidence that at least 3 different weapons were used to perpetrate the crime, suggesting multiple assailants. Had Kimsey acted alone, the question has been raised as to why he would attempt to conceal his actions, knowing that he was already wanted for attempted murder. Living a transient and nomadic lifestyle under assumed identities, why would he bother to transport the bodies on a difficult and lengthy journey through the snow to Lava Lake? And why would he expend the time and effort to saw a hole in the ice and hide the bodies under its surface, rather than just leaving them at the scene before fleeing? In recent years, a familial link has since been discovered between Charles Kimsey and a man named Ray Van Buren Jackson, who was a schoolteacher in the locality. Jackson had long been suspected of involvement in the deaths of at least 6 local residents during the early 1900s, all of whom passed away in circumstances that proved controversial or unsolved. And whilst he was never arrested or charged with any of these killings, which included staged suicides and poisonings, he was found to have direct links to all 6 of the deceased. The savage nature in which the victims at Lava Lake were killed, and the brutality in which the injuries were administered, suggests that this was a crime in which the killer displayed a severe emotional disconnect, much like the Villisca Axe murders which had taken place 20 years before. And whilst the profiles of the victims and the circumstances are very different to those killings, the clinical and efficient manner in which they took place does raise the prospect that a serial killer, or killers, may have targeted the unfortunate trappers. With the amount of time which has elapsed since the Lava Lake murders, it is now unlikely that this mystery will ever be solved. The most obvious hypothesis remains that Charles Kimsey was indeed the killer, and only the possibility that his physical appearance had altered so drastically during the lengthy time taken to apprehend him saved him from being convicted of the crime, but the manner of the killings, and the possible links to another suspected serial killer, raise uneasy questions. And whilst we may now never know the answers, we take heart in the hope that by sharing this story, someone may again, at some future point, attempt to solve this tragic and senseless crime.